Lady Fitzalen's Room, written and read by Christopher Halton. I penned this account some years past, following an unexpected turn of events during one of the most severe winter storms on record. The storm, a complete surprise to the coastal regions of Essex, marked one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. But that, as you will soon discover, was just the beginning of my account. In early February 1820, I travelled by mail coach from Colchester to the port of Harwich, where I planned to embark by packet boat on a business trip to the continent. The journey started fairly uneventfully when we set off from the George Hotel coaching inn early in the afternoon. The sky was clear and bright, although a frosty winter sun still glistened ice from the roofs of passing houses. The air was so bitter that even the nostrils of the mail coach's horses emitted a thick cloud of steamy air as they pressed hard along the icy-packed stone road, but at least the climate was still manageable. Our coach driver, a rather stocky and bullish fellow called Dodgson, and his guard were quite determined from the start of the journey that we would arrive on time, as competition was fierce on these coaching routes. The almost maniacal cracking of his whip on now sweaty horseflesh ensured the weather did not delay us despite the condition of the slippery road that frequently caused the coach to slide on its dangerous icy sheen. The fear was palpable on my face and the faces of two accompanying passengers, a middle-aged man and a woman. She had a certain air of good breeding, whilst her partner lacked the same bearing quality and seemed somewhat duplicitous, with two beady eyes and a round ruddy face in dire need of a good shave. As I observed, he struck me as no gentleman. Although he and the woman were well dressed, they both seemed incongruous as a couple. By way of polite introduction, they said they were the Reverend Struther and his wife Imelda, who were as hoping as I was to catch the 7 p.m. packet departing from Harwich to the Hook of Holland. Their keenness to leave that evening was indicative of other passengers at the George being unwilling to accompany us that day because of the frigid prevailing weather. For my own case, it was necessary, as I had a meeting with business contacts in Brussels, which could not be delayed. However, we were all well wrapped in blankets, which to a degree removed the acerbity of the cold. Our comfort, however, was secondary to the driver and guard, and despite protestations by banging our fists on the coach wall behind the driver to slow down, we were ignored entirely. And so, for the next hour, the sliding and bumpy coach continued on its route until the ice slowly thawed as a warmer yet ominous presence of dark clouds drew in across the sky. The journey should have taken around 4 hours in typical weather, but despite the coachman's best efforts, the prevailing conditions delayed the journey. The horses were struggling as it started to snow in flurries, which soon became heavier and blizzard-like as a strong wind blew in from the North Sea. The headwind turned the dull greyness of a winter landscape into whiteness as the snow settled and started to drift. The fear and anxiety were perceptible, and the Struthers became increasingly uneasy as the situation worsened. Reluctantly, Dodgson and the guard stopped the horses and jumped off from their open seats to speak to us. Dodgson, a bearded man in his late 30s, was undoubtedly tough. He was small in stature but physically well built, and had the bearing and demeanour of a former soldier. He was well padded against the cold in a 3/4 length frock coat, a top hat and thick leather gloves. The male guard, a much younger man in his 20s, was much taller and slimmer than Dodgson. He was dressed in a Royal Mail employee's uniform, a gold-braided scarlet frock coat with blue lapels and a black top hat with a gold band. He was clean-shaven and introduced himself as Richard Mortimer, speaking with a soft East Midlands accent. As we gathered around the two men, we shielded our faces with our arms from the biting ice. Such was the veracity of the weather. Dodgson's assertive voice informed us that it would be impossible to proceed further, but he knew of a nearby country house that may offer us shelter until the worsening weather blew over. None of us was pleased, as we would undoubtedly miss the packet. However, to proceed further would be suicide, as the landscape was slowly absorbed by a blanket of drifting snow, which provided even greater danger should we accidentally leave the road and enter a ditch. Frustratingly, we agreed to his proposal, and within 15 minutes of literally driving through a white wall of blown drifting snow, we arrived at the signposted Fitzalen house, a large, rambling, timber-framed Elizabethan-era manorial building situated well off the beaten track. By this time, the blizzard had eased as the wind dropped, but the snow was as relentless as ever. The house was imposing, constructed of a sturdy English oak frame and filled with herringbone brick. The 4 chimneys, made of the same material, were formed into twisted spirals, adding a touch of grandeur to the structure. The window frames were of mullioned oak and fitted with leaded glass, which were painted with armorial bearings depicting a variety of shields and heraldic emblems, adding to the place's mystery and intrigue. It was plainly once a house owned by a noble family, but who I was yet to discover. But first, something was odd and inescapable. There appeared to be no smoke from the chimneys, nor any lights within. Dodgson wearily took the coach to the side of the building, where a yard and stables came into view. Having halted and alighted from the coach, he instructed us to wait with the mail guard while he went to the house to speak with the owner. The guard then unhitched the 4 horses and took them to a large barn where they were tethered. After some minutes, Dodgson failed to return, and darkness was drawing in. Mortimer was very concerned, as indeed were we. He drew a loaded blunderbuss firearm from the coach and asked us to accompany him, as he intended to find out what the delay was. The Anstruvers feared what fate may have befallen the driver and decided to remain wrapped warmly in blankets inside the coach while we went to investigate. Mr. Anstruver had a loaded flintlock for protection and insisted they would be far better and safer to sit briefly until our return. We agreed and set off in the now 6-inch deep snow, which gathering apace had virtually covered Dodgson's tracks. The journey to the house was eerie, the only sound being the crunch of our boots in the snow. The darkness seemed to swallow us whole as we trudged through the snow, our breath forming clouds in the frigid air. From the faint traces left in the snow, we were led to a rear door with ornate Elizabethan figures carved around the frame. The heavy door, by comparison, was plainly panelled with a wrought iron ring knocker, which I rapped once. It was swiftly answered by Dodgson, who was in the process of returning to the coach. "Ah," he smiled, "I have just spoken to the caretaker, Mr. Ambrose, as the owners are abroad, and he has agreed to allow us to stay due to the weather. He was in the house checking the property because of it." He then explained that the conditions for a living are Spartan, as the house has been empty since this past year, as the owner, Sir Lawrence Fitzalen, prefers living in his estate in Italy. He apparently inherited Fitzalen Hall from his late aunt, but has never actually set foot here. As such, Mr. Ambrose didn't think there would be an issue, but there are conditions, as he will explain shortly. He then escorted us from the rear kitchen into a lofty wainscoted hall of considerable size, which now had a lit log fire in the large brick fireplace. Dodgson and Mortimer left us briefly to remove our luggage and the mail for safeguarding during the night. This brief respite from all that was happening allowed me some minutes to admire the architecture. The hall was in fact of 14th century medieval design. It had a beamed ceiling that arched into the braced roof, and in the middle, facing from the rear of the building, a minstrel gallery overlooking the hall to its heavy flagstoned floor. It was a truly archaic design, wondrously adorned with shields bearing various coats of arms similar to those on the windows, with a suit of armour standing almost imperiously on guard by the main door holding a sword. In contrast, other weaponry such as pikes, axes and swords embellished the dark wooden panelling. Additionally, the walls had Elizabethan-era motifs and figures carved into the woodwork. The central piece was a truly ancient refectory table with long benches seating perhaps 20 people. It was a medieval masterpiece, although the others were less than impressed, especially with the now gathered Anstruvers complaining that it felt more like a mausoleum than a house. Still, even they had to agree the prospect of staying in this 5-bedroom property was better than freezing to death in a mail coach. After both men had completed the removals from the coach, they stood and warmed themselves in front of the fire. Mortimer then elected to remain in the hall with the mail and sleep on a rug near the fire, while everyone else waited for Mr. Ambrose to return and delegate rooms. Presently Mr. Ambrose joined us, wearing a fur hat and sheepskin coat. He was probably in his early 70s, and was quite sprite for his age. He was holding a lit candlestick, which lit brightly his ready-cheeked face with a kindly demeanour and warm, gentle eyes. Calling us all to the refectory table, he swept his hands to indicate that we sat down, whilst he stood at the head of the table, having placed the candle before him. Clearing his throat before the assembled guests, he said with an assuring voice, "I must admit I certainly wasn't expecting guests tonight, but outside, had I refused, you would surely have perished from the cold. And as a God-fearing man, I could not let that happen." He cleared his throat and continued, "I have prepared 3 rooms for you and have found sufficient blankets to remain warm. I have also prepared a fire for you in each room, but there is little here that would afford greater comfort. Sadly, there is no food in the kitchen, but a pump there will supply clean drinkable water from a spring. Should you want to fortify yourself on this cold night, some bottles of brandy are in the cassone chest by the fireplace with glasses." He paused, then added, "I will bring you some eggs and cooked pork in the morning. I have provided hay for your horses. They should be safe in the barn. My only fear is whether the weather will clear in time to allow you all to leave in the morning." Looking more serious, he stressed, "You have the free rein of the house, but I would ask you not to enter the room that stands before you immediately at the top of the stairs and in front of the staircase. That was my late employer's room, Lady Fitzalen. There is nothing in there of interest, but I have left the door locked according to her wishes and out of respect." He then showed us to our respective rooms while we deposited our baggage. After that he bade us good night and left to return to his home with a lantern and wearing snowshoes, as the soft ice was now at least a foot deep. It had stopped snowing and the wind had finally cleared, leaving a full moon in the clear night sky. I finally breathed a sigh of relief, and after sharing a glass of brandy with the others, I retired to my room for a hopefully less eventful night's sleep, while remaining clothed to keep warm. A woman's scream awakened me from my slumber a few hours later. Confused by my sleepiness, I scrambled to my feet, put on my frock coat and lit a small lantern to discover the source of this commotion. I saw Mrs. Anstruther outside on her knees, crying hysterically in front of Lady Fitzalen's room. Before I could speak, I was quickly joined by the others, with Mortimer waving his gun around in sheer blind panic as he stared into the darkness and aimed the weapon at some invisible foe, and even Dodgson appeared in an anxious state. I immediately took control of the situation and shouted, "In the name of God, everyone, please calm down, and Mrs. Anstruther, kindly explain what has happened." Raising the now gibbering and tear-stained woman to her feet, I said calmly, "Pray, madam, tell me why you are so distressed." Still sobbing, she pointed her hand at the door. Oh my God, my Gerald, he... She then collapsed and passed out. I then took Mortimer's blunderbuss and ordered the coachman to carry her downstairs to the hall. There she recovered from the smelling salts I had brought from my room and seemed more lucid, but was still sobbing and speaking incoherently. However, I gathered the following from her responses. She claimed that Lady Fitzalen's door was unlocked, and her husband had decided to peep inside to see the fuss with Mr. Ambrose's warning. She claimed she implored him not to enter, but he did not think it was an issue. After swinging the door open and stepping inside with a candlestick, the door immediately closed behind him. Despite repeatedly calling out to him, there were no responses. The door remained firmly locked, and the room was silent. It was then that I appeared from my room. I sat her on a bench and sat astride, facing her directly. Staring into her eyes, I calmly said, "Before we left the George in Colchester, I had an opportunity to glance at the passenger list. You both were shown as the Reverend and Mrs. Austin Anstruther, and now you say his name is Gerald. And what of the door?" I checked it briefly before I went to sleep, and it was, as Mr. Ambrose had said, quite locked. So tell me, what was a cleric and his wife visiting Holland for? You certainly weren't going on holiday, as you only carried one piece of luggage each. I turned to Dodgson and asked him to bring their bags into the hall. I was sure these two were not the people they claimed to be, and for some undisclosed reason seemed rather in a great hurry to leave these shores. She quickly gathered her senses and attempted to pursue Dodgson, but was restrained by Mortimer. Dodgson returned with two still unpacked leather bags, which he placed on the ground before her. I said, "Would you care to open these bags for inspection, or shall I take the honour?" She suddenly regained her composure and aggressively replied, "Go ahead, sir, and if you dare, I will sue you through the courts and take a pretty penny from you, for you have no legal right to do this." Dodgson opened both bags and out-tipped high-quality gold and silver jewellery, all studded with rubies, emeralds, sapphires and diamonds. I instantly recognised the most beautiful piece as stolen from a country house burglary a few months ago. Known as the Princess von Mecklenburg tiara, it was featured in the London Gazette with a substantial reward for its return. The haul from both bags included many loose rubies, sapphires, diamonds and emeralds, which had probably been ripped from other stolen items. Confronted with the evidence of some misdeeds, Mrs. Anstruther at last seemed resigned to her fate and admitted that her name was Imelda Stratton. She was a former governess for the Countess of Norwich, and as such travelled frequently across the country and abroad, entering many fine estates that contained wealth beyond most people's imagination. Being from an impoverished branch of the nobility, she was easily treated as a confidant by many wealthy houses, and from these confidences she knew what jewellery these people owned and, more often than not, where it was kept. Security among them was so poor that many fine items were kept in their bedrooms, in jewellery boxes or dressing table drawers. Her missing husband was a confidence trickster she met some years ago, often posing as a cleric. He was also skilled in the art of burglary, and having these abilities proved a good combination with her connections to the rich. She also admitted that she had recently left her post, and both were hoping to dispose of their acquired wealth to an unscrupulous precious stones dealer in Amsterdam. She was adamant that her partner, now admitted to be a Gerald Hinchcliffe, genuinely discovered the door to Lady Fitzalen's room unlocked, and that he could not resist looking inside when the door closed and locked him inside. With all that had happened today, I could not say I was shocked by conventional standards. It was too much to comprehend. Imelda, the jewellery and the mailboxes were placed under Mortimer's guard. He shackled her to the refectory table with manacles that were retained officially as part of his duty as a male guard. She was still bereft with the loss of her partner and would no longer pose a threat to the three of us who were left. Of course, what were we to do about the missing man? Her story seemed improbable, but what if all she said was true? After all, she admitted to the jewellery theft, so why would she lie? Leaving Mortimer and his prisoner downstairs, we went to Lady Fitzalen's bedroom door. It was still very much locked, and despite repeatedly rapping the door, we could not elicit a response from within. Dodgson then, in frustration, tried forcing the door with his shoulder, but this door would not budge. It was built like all the doors in this house, which was made of English oak, and was at least an inch thick. As oak ages, a chemical process makes the wood more durable and substantially stronger. The door frame was of similar construction as the heavy door lock, which was hand-forged, and with time and age it was almost welded to the door and frame. Likewise, the hinges were of hand-forged strapwork similar to the lock. In short, it seemed impossible to open. It was now edging towards 3 a.m., and the heavy beat of a wall clock echoed much louder in the hall. An air of tension pervaded the property, and at this point I resolved to go to Mr. Ambrose's home to enlist his assistance, as Hinchcliffe had seemingly come to some harm in the room. But as I attempted to leave, the exit doors to the front and rear were firmly locked, as were the windows, which would not budge. In short, we were all trapped inside by some strange, nefarious force that had failed to identify itself. We removed 2 heavy medieval axes from a fixture above the fireplace that was still quite serviceable for my purpose. Firstly, I wanted to force an entry into Lady Fitzalen's room, as my immediate concern was the safety of Hinchcliffe. Then, I wanted to find a way of opening an external door to seek Ambrose. Having returned to Lady Fitzalen's door with Dodgson, I raised my axe to strike it. Quite unexpectedly, the door groaned as it gently swung partially open. We were caught entirely off guard and lowered our axes to assess the situation. Dodgson naturally appeared quite jittery and nervously looked at me and then at the door, saying in a subdued voice, "Do you want to go in, sir, because whatever is in there indeed isn't Master Hinchcliffe?" Before answering him, I used the axe to push the door into the room, and the light from candlesticks showed a barren, empty small bedroom, devoid of any furniture or indeed the missing man. Fleetingly in the flickering light, I thought I saw a shadow dart across a shuttered window, but nothing, absolutely nothing whatsoever. It looked from large deposits of dust to have been empty for many a year. And faintly I observed what looked to be human footprints etched into the residue of dirt, and leading from the threshold of the door to the far right corner of the room, which appeared to have a partially open panel in the wainscoted walls. We decided to venture in after first summoning Mortimer to join us. Mortimer peered into the void, looked as shocked as us, and asked me, "What do you intend to do?" It was self-evident that none of us wanted to enter that accursed room, even less the open-panelled door. I requested Mortimer give me his blunderbuss and to jam the bedroom door frame with an axe to prevent its closure after we entered. Having agreed, I first entered slowly with the weapon, while Dodgson held a lit candelabra that brightened the room as we entered. The smell inside was that of old wood and something else, and although indefinable, it was foul and corrupt. Hesitatingly, we edged slowly towards the open panel from which emanated a gentle draught that defined the foul smell more starkly and self-evidently was evil. I could see that the panel was a secret door that opened to a flight of red brick steps spiralling down into the darkness. The walls were also of the same brick and were as old as the house. Again on the dusty steps, I saw the impressions of what looked to be Hinchcliffe's shoes leading down into the darkness. Crossing myself and saying a brief prayer, I led Dodgson deep down and beneath the house's foundations. The secret panel and steps suggested that we may be inside a staircase leading to a priest's hole, a place secretly built to hide Catholic priests who were avoiding persecution during Elizabeth I's reign. But what permeated the atmosphere in that room was less than holy, and the tension increased as we made our way down to what appeared to be a basement area. As we quietly emerged, we saw what appeared to be a rancid and rotten human corpse, busily indulged in eating the remains of Hinchcliffe. The only way I knew it was him was by the blood-soaked remains of his frock coat. This foul obscenity to God sounded like a starving animal as it ripped into what remained of Hinchcliffe. The creature that once appeared to have been female was too busy indulging in its meal to notice our presence, but as we stepped forward it looked into our light and screamed, as if blinded by candlelight. The scream was chilling and reverberated around the chamber like some banshee from hell. Instinctively I fired the blunderbuss into its head, which caused it to stagger backwards momentarily, and then I grabbed the axe from Dodgson and swung its blade with such force that it severed the creature's head from its body. Whatever it was now quite dead, and now I resolved to speak to Ambrose if only this house would allow us out. Having returned with Dodgson to the warm confines of the hall, I broke the news to Imelda, who was racked with torment and grief. Leaving the others temporarily, I went to the rear kitchen door to discover it was unlocked, and I went outside. The weather had now changed, the snow was melting, and it started to rain. I went to Ambrose's home and raised him from his sleep. He appeared unhappy with my intrusion, but when I explained that a passenger had died, he asked me, "Has someone been into Lady Fitzalen's room?" I nodded grimly, and still dressed in a nightgown and cap. He invited me into a small but well-appointed lounge. Having lit some candelabra, he asked me to sit, and so I told him of the encounter and death of the creature. While listening intently, he shook his head and looked sad. He said, "I wasn't being entirely honest with you because Lady Fitzalen was, I suppose, technically alive." He explained that 5 years ago, while on a trip to Egypt, Lady Fitzalen was cursed by a fakir following a tomb excavation dispute. The fakir, as a member of an ancient Egyptian cult, claimed their spiritual leader, a high priest named Serapion, was buried there, and she was despoiling his tomb. She, of course, refused, and he uttered a curse on her that would turn her into a living corpse once she returned to England. She would, in his words, become a creature so vile she would lust for raw human and animal flesh, and be gifted with specific powers to ensnare her victims. Sure enough, a year later, she suddenly started to change, and the transition took her from a vibrant woman in her mid-50s into this despicable creature with a body of slowly rotting flesh, who was utterly inhuman. Her nephew briefly came over from Italy and paid body snatchers to remove a freshly interred woman's body of similar age from Colchester, and then substitute her body for Lady Fitzalen's. Her death was then officially announced, and the corpse was placed without due haste in her tomb. This facilitated her nephew's legal control of the estate as the sole beneficiary of her will. The living corpse of Lady Fitzalen was confined in the priest's hole, with access to the locked room, which had its windows barred and shuttered. Ambrose, her former butler, visited her daily, fed her raw animal meat, and ensured the door remained locked. However, with the powers granted by the fakir, she evidently could remotely control the mechanisms of the doors and windows. To resolve this terrible situation, he agreed, as the controlling agent for the estate, to pay Imelda Stratton a generous yearly allowance to compensate her for losing her partner and to buy the coachman's silence. The others discussed this offer, and they agreed to the proposal. The stolen jewels were later anonymously passed to London's Bow Street runners, a policing authority, who returned them to their respective owners where possible. And there my story ends. Of course, we were able to continue our journey to Harwich, but due to the change in circumstances, none of us made it to the continent, with me, a lawyer, being delegated with the jewels' return. A footnote. I discovered recently that Fitzalen House had caught fire in mysterious circumstances following Ambrose's death. The entire property was reduced to brick and embers, and the land was cleared and sold to a local farmer. The end.